This little video is meant to be watched probably right before you read On the Verge, the excerpt from On the Verge, with a copy of it in front of you for taking quick notes of anything that will help you. So you might want to pause it for a second, make sure you've got the play. I know this first slide is about Glengarry Glen Ross. I want to talk about a contrast between the two things. So first of all, yesterday's excerpt from Glengarry Glen Ross. It's probably pretty obvious what that has to do with the assignment you're about to do. After all, you've got two characters in an enclosed space, just like you're required to do in your assignment. In this case, it's a booth in a Chinese restaurant, but the fact is they're there, they're sort of stuck together, they're having a conflict. In fact, what they need and what they want is directly in conflict. Not in the same way necessarily as in what you're going to write, but one of the two would prefer not to be having this conversation and wants to just be left alone to do his job. The other feels like he's going to lose his job and wants the other one to start treating him differently. And by the end of the scene, this is the real key, and this is what it most has to do with your assignment. By the end, one of the two, Williamson, basically wins. He makes his point that I'm not giving the leads to anybody other than those who are selling the best. That's the company policy. That's what I'm told by my supervisors. That's the way it's going to be. And all of the cussing that Levine has been doing and all of the pleading and all of his anger hasn't really gotten him anything. Williamson's attitude hasn't changed from the beginning to the end of those 4 or 5 pages of text. And it's not some magical outside thing where the phone rings and someone says, it's for you. It's my supervisor giving you a message. Or where someone comes in off the street and interrupts the conversation and says, quick, we have to go down the block because I have just seen a giant alligator and it's running amok in the streets. And, it's very tempting in trying to figure out how to end a scene to have something come from outside the scene to magically fix things. You've probably heard the term the God in the machine, Deus ex machina from the Greek, the idea that just something in those cases, one of the gods, will intervene to end the play. Well, that doesn't really help anything. The whole point of your assignment here is between your two characters to have the conversation show us which one of them wins. And so that's what happens in Glengarry Glen Ross. So that was our first model because it's really closely aligned with what you're trying to do in your own scene. The other example I'm asking you to read right now takes a similar concept, but takes the idea of realism and turns it into a very different idea of believability. After all, real estate salespeople, Glengarry Glen Ross, sitting in a local restaurant, having lunch. Totally realistic, not just believable, but no doubt happened all the time in the 1980s. Time-traveling characters, whose story begins around 1890-ish and persists mainly through the first 30 years or so of the 20th century, that obviously is not realistic. Nobody from the late 19th century time-traveled through the early and middle 20th century. So it's not a question of whether this is realistic, but there are some things in this that are extremely believable. That's how we can actually follow the scene. For example, the ways in which the women interact with each other, the ways in which they talk to each other, very much believable throughout the whole scene. The things that they want as people. Now, in this particular scene, you're only going to really get to know the desires of 2 or 3 of the 4 people who come on stage, but that's because it's just a 5-page excerpt. But the writer has kept completely consistently what they want, what they need, and what they're doing to try to get those things. Finally, how characters react to what happens to them based on their needs and their wants. That's really what playwriting is all about. It's something I emphasized in the notes yesterday in class, and it's the way in which this scene will be most helpful to you as a model. Kind of weird things happen to time-traveling characters. People just sort of pop up as they go through the future. Transmissions pop into their heads from the future. The ways they react to those things are completely consistent with what kinds of people they are. So, to be exact, Mary and Alex. We don't get very much of Mary in these pages, so you can't really worry about her. She has big scenes in other parts of the play. Alex, however, really helps to kick this scene off. We see her interacting with Fanny in a way that shows the contrast between the two. Alex is totally into whatever craziness comes from traveling through time. Fanny is a little more cautious, a little more common sense. So she ends up calling Alex a feckless child. And it's not surprising that Alex is the person who's getting these transmissions out of the blue and who reacts to them like that's totally normal. She's ready for whatever happens. That helps us to understand not just her, but it helps us to understand Fanny. The scene you're going to read here is really Fanny's scene. The three women, Mary, Alex, and Fanny, dominate the entire play together. They make up 90% of the dialogue in this play, which is much longer than this little scene. Mr. Coffee is a recurring character who takes on different personae in the course of the play. In this particular bit that you're reading, as Levine and Williamson dominated the piece you saw in Glengarry Glen Ross, Fanny and Mr. Coffee dominate here. Two people. They're not exactly in an enclosed space, although there's an extent to which they are. They're on a part of the journey that has boundaries. And so they have their needs and their desires. Mr. Coffee is here to give some really delicate information to Fanny. You know, her husband has died. She's writing him a letter through the whole play. And from her point of view, this letter is several weeks or maybe a month or two long. The problem is that in those several weeks, she has traversed 50, 60 years of time. So her husband has in fact died over the course of all of that time. But in her world, not that much time has passed. So she's still writing this letter. And Mr. Coffee comes to kind of help her understand what has happened. That's what his job is. That's what he needs to do. Fanny, of course, needs to hear that. She needs that information to continue on her journey. But her desires are different. She doesn't really want to hear that for obvious reasons. So she's in this position of like, I need to hear this, but I don't know that I want to. And Mr. Coffee's in this position of, I've got to get this information across to you. So the ways in which the two of them interact with each other in their conversation are entirely based on that. The way he talks to her, the things he does, the gestures he offers, and the ways in which she responds are about what they're trying to do. And it's really the basic nature of Fanny's character here that drives everything. She's completely common sense. She really does enjoy the adventure of time traveling, but not the danger and the fun. Not in the way that Alex does. She knows she didn't belong in the Victorian world. She has to accept the change of the future in order to find the right place for herself. It's a requirement of her personality. She doesn't think it's fun necessarily. Sometimes, in fact, she thinks it's kind of terrifying, but she's not going to be turned back. She's very straightforward. She's very honest with herself about what she must do. So she does it. So when you read the scene, I want you to be thinking about those facts. The characters you're reading don't have to be completely realistic. They have to be believable. In your own assignment, you are required to write about the actual world of 2018. The reason that requirement is there is otherwise you'd have to do a ton of research. The playwright for On the Verge had to do a ton of research about clothing and about language and about social structures in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, because the play was written just in the last 20 to 30 years. I don't want you in a position where you have to do that, so you'll read in your requirements for your assignment, hopefully you already have read, you're required to use the current world that we're already in. So to some extent, your piece will be quote-unquote realistic. But it doesn't have to be entirely realistic. If your two characters want to be having a conversation about a giant Godzilla balloon that has arrived at one of their homes, and that's kind of the purpose of their being in this enclosed space, whatever it is together, that's not particularly realistic. But if their interactions are believable, based on the world that they're in and what they're saying to each other, fine, the scene can still work. Just make sure your scene conforms to all of the rules in the assignment. They're very clear, delineated one after the other. I'm not going to extend this video by 4 more minutes by reading them aloud to you, but I'm going to ask that you go read On the Verge, think about what I've said here, study it, compare it with Glengarry Glen Ross, and then go to the assignment and see exactly what you need to do, and let me know if you have any questions. As you get this video, you'll still have 7 days for this assignment. Use your time, ask questions. Good luck.